Are we good?
You're good.
Awesome, thank you. So today I'll be talking about broadtooth rat scat surveys in the Otways. I have been promising to talk about this at each of these conferences for the last few years, and every year our plans to do the scat surveys have been thwarted by COVID, but I'll be presenting actual results today because we managed to get out there in April and do some scat surveys. So the work that I'm talking about today was conducted on the lands of the Eastern Ma, Garbanud and Girai Wurrung peoples, and I'm coming to you today from the land of the Bunurong people. So I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present from these various nations, and also extend my respects to any traditional owners who are tuning in today. So this is the broadtooth rat. It's also known as the tuarana. That's the federally recognised Indigenous name for the species. It's a Palawa name, so it comes from Tassie. And it's just the one that's been assigned at a federal level for these little fluff balls. They're a relatively small native rodent. They're not so small as, a smoky mouse or a New Holland mouse, but they're a little bit smaller than your standard swamp rat or bush rat. They are called Mastochromes fuscus. Excuse this phylogeny, but they are technically well nested within the Pseudomys genus. So your heath mice and smokies and things, they're within that group. And like all others, most other Pseudomys species, they've undergone a massive decline in the last 50 odd years, and likely an even larger decline in the last 200 years. We just don't have the data to really show us that. So Stella Shipway did her masters on reassessing the status of broadtooths across Victoria back in 2014-15. And she was unable to find them at about half of their pre-1990 sites. So it does seem like we've lost them from a lot of areas. They occupy a wide-ish range of habitats. So you get them everywhere from way up in the Alps right down to Parker Inlet and the Otways, right down at the coast, in all types of woodlands and forests and grasslands. But the key uniting factor is the grasses. So you find them in areas with nice grasses and sedges. They absolutely love poa tussocks. So if you come across an area that has really nice poa tussocks, it's a really good place to start looking for them. And they basically just eat these grasses and sedges. So that's why it's the guiding principle for where to find their habitat is these beautiful grasses and sedges. Because that is basically their entire diet, it means that they are producing these very characteristic scats. So this is from Stella's work. This is on the far, number A is this bright green, fresh little banana of a scat. And then B, they're slightly dried out, but they are still very green. And if you were to squish one of those scats, it's quite spongy and very fibrous. And then as they get really old, they dry out into just this basically yellowy straw kind of material. Less likely to find these really dry yellow ones in the Otways because it is so wet out there that they tend to just turn to mush before they manage to dry out properly. But it means that this is a way that we can actually survey for the species. So when we go out to survey for broadtooth rat scat, we look for their tunnels. They basically eat these little tunnels and pathways into the grass, and they look kind of similar to swamp rat tunnels. So if you find a nice grassy area with thick grass that they can build the tunnels through, once you find those tunnels, you just look on the ground within the tunnel and try and find the scat, and then you can check and see whether it's going to be broadtooth scat or swamp rat scat. And when you find broadtooth scat, you usually find it in great abundance because they are producing a huge amount of scat, because you need to eat a lot when all you're eating is grass to get enough energy from it. So this scat here in the middle, that's just broken in half. You can see, hopefully you can see in this quality, it's basically as if someone just got a lump of grass, chewed it up, spat it out and rolled it into a little cylinder. So when you break them apart, they don't stink. They smell just kind of like mown grass, and it's just pure grass in there. And that's how you know that it's come from a broadtooth. So in the Otways, there's been historic records well across from Big Hill out to Port Campbell. They're really patchy though, and there's been some pretty large gaps in when these records have occurred and in survey effort for the species. So even though there's been huge amounts of camera trap effort and small mammal trapping across the Otways, these guys can be pretty hard to detect because on camera traps, they really look very similar to swamp rats, and they're pretty shy from Elliott traps. So it's really hard to actually get them despite all of the amazing small mammal survey effort that's gone into the area. So that's where the Scat surveys come in. They're a much easier way to find out whether the species is still present in the area. So Sakib Kazi and I from the zoo went out in April and surveyed across all these historical sites and also just drove around roads looking for suitable habitat. And we found a fair number of scats. So these little green squares are positive detection sites from this April. The little grey triangles are sites where we didn't find the scat, and then the blue ones are places where we found sort of old degraded scat that we would want to confirm with fresher scat before being confident that the species is still present there, just because the scat can persist in the landscape for quite some time. Up in the Alps, apparently it can be years that the scat can survive in the landscape. I don't think it would be that long in the Otways just because it is so wet. But yeah, we'd want to recheck those sites for some fresher scat before we know that they're really there still. So our survey method is basically driving around, spotting some nice grass. As soon as we get out of the car and start looking, we start a timer. We set a 10-minute timer, and if we don't find the scats within 10 minutes, we move on. So average time to finding scat is just under 3 minutes. The longest it's taken us for a positive detection was just under 10 minutes, but that's really an outlier. It usually is a lot quicker. Once you find those tunnels, you're going to either find the scats or you're not going to. And sometimes it takes no time at all before you can even start the timer. As you're getting out of the car, you see the tunnels and you see the scats and they're there. So once you get your eye in for this, it's a really quick, easy survey method to just throw into other like day-to-day surveys. So if there's any take-home message from this, it's that you guys can do these surveys as well while you're out and about in the Otways. If you see some nice grassy habitat, to just start looking for that scat. So the habitats that we were getting them in were pretty variable. So on the left-hand side here, we've got some more classic habitat where you've got really nice grass tussocks. The mown lawn next to it isn't ideal, but it's still a good food source provided they don't get picked off by cats and foxes. But so getting them in places like that is pretty standard. In the middle, you've got a nice roadside, plenty of grass, nice shrubs on the edges. So one of the good places to find tunnels is on that sort of, on the periphery of like, you've got your forest and you've got the little shrubby patch next to it with the grass from the roadside heading into there, and that edge where the shrubs meet the grass, you can often see the tunnels really well, and it's a really good place to look for the scat. So lots of these records are just from that kind of roadside vegetation, just driving around the Otways. On the right-hand side here is an example of one of the most incredibly degraded sites that we got them at. So this is up near Beech Forest. You've got pine plantation on one side, awful blackberry thicket in the middle, and then some like partially mown grass next to the road. And we were getting plenty of broadtooth rat tunnels and scat heading into that blackberry. So not your standard ideal broadtooth habitat, but still somewhere that they were persisting. And on the other side of the road from this is a logged plantation. So really interesting things to consider in terms of where the species might be hanging on, and then how to manage for the species in those really suboptimal habitats. So with what does this mean for management of the species? It's a bit awkward, and I don't really have any good answers for that at this stage, but it's just something to consider when maintaining roads and fuel breaks, is that those roads and fuel breaks can actually be really good habitat for this species and can actually create good habitat for the species. So places where like shrubs are being controlled near roads allows that grass to grow up and creates really beautiful habitat, but then slashing that grass to like reduce fuel loads and improve visibility can actually remove the habitat for the species, at least temporarily. So this is one of Sakib's sites from up in the Central Highlands. In February last year, he got plenty of broadtooth rat sign in this grass on a roadside, went back a couple of months later and it had been slashed, and he couldn't find any rat scat in the grass or off into the veg off on the side of the road. So it's uncertain whether the species has persisted there, but hopefully they'll be able to recolonize from elsewhere. But it's just something to consider, potentially leaving at least a strip of nice grass when doing slashing like that. They're incredibly susceptible to predation by cats and foxes because they are a Sodomy species. They have all those classic traits of being really, really bad at predator awareness. They're like super chill, really docile, very easy meal. So even if you have if you've got bush rats and swamp rats and things present with them, cats and foxes are going to still be more likely to pick off these guys because they're just so easy to catch. They don't particularly like fire. If you burn away all the grass, they have no food and nowhere to hide. In this photo, you can see after all the grass has been burnt away, you can see their little runways. So there's little white tracks on the ground are actually little broadtooth rat runways, which is really cool to see, but also very sad because they're not going to be persisting in that landscape. They're also really susceptible to flooding. So this is one of Sakib's really beautiful sites from up in the Central Highlands. It got fully inundated during a flood, and then even after the flood waters receded, that habitat has been really degraded. So hopefully for this site, once that habitat comes back, there'll be animals in the area that can recolonize that spot, but it's just one of those threats that we don't think about a huge amount for these species. And if you have those really small little habitat patches, you could knock out local populations could get knocked out by events like flooding. They're also really susceptible to overgrazing by things like deer and overabundant kangaroos, just because if you're eating all that grass away, there's nothing left for the rats. And obviously climate change and drought are a massive issue for the species. They tend to occur in much wetter areas where the grass is really luscious, which is why the Otways is such a great place for them. But as that grass dries out and dies with drought, yeah, it doesn't leave a lot for them to hold on to. So take home message, do your own scat surveys. It's fun and easy, I promise. Once you get your eye in for it, it'll just become second nature, hopefully, while you're out there doing other work in the Otways. So when you see like a really nice sort of thick grassy area, have a look, see if you can find some tunnels, find that scat, take some photos of it. If you want, you can pop it in a Ziploc bag and stick it in the freezer if you want to double check and make sure that it is broadtooth scat. And you can email Sakib or I for help with confirming that scat ID. So thank you to Sakib and our boss Marissa, and Barb and Mark and Darcy and the small mammal team, and obviously PV and the CEC for help and assistance and guiding us to good spots in the Otways.
Thanks so much, Phoebe, and we're pretty well on time for morning tea, which is brilliant because I need a coffee. We've got one question here for you at the moment. What is the minimum height of grass that should be left for the BTR?
It's a hard question to give an exact answer to, but I would more go for like leaving a strip of like untouched grass. So you want grass that's like at least kind of half a foot tall, but like dense. So like dense enough that you can like have little tunnels going into it, and that can provide some protection and shelter. And yeah, but like if you can leave, like if you can clear just a bit of grass like near the road and then leave a patch of grass, yeah, on the other side, that's probably going to help them.
Cool, thank you. there might be some more that come up in the chat, in the Q&A section. Phoebe, if you could keep an eye out, that'd be great.